Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Now that my two obligatory informative videos are done for the day, it's time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. And I was watching one of Mark Bell's videos because I've been going through a lot of YouTube fitness lately, looking for different topics and events and things to talk about with you guys. And I don't regularly watch Mark Bell. Yes, I know I'm a powerlifter. Yes, I'm a strength athlete, but I don't actually watch Mark Bell that much. I really don't. And so I was noticed that he has a road to a 500 bench press at 220 series. And I'm like, what is this, equipped or raw? Then I go check it's raw. It's like, holy shit. Okay. He's working towards a 500 raw bench. And by the time this video's up, he might have already done the meet. Working towards a 500 raw bench at 220. That's pretty ridiculous. So I'm watching him test his openers, his video testing his openers, and I'll get to the profound statement in a minute. And he's testing openers, and he comes out with a hoodie and sleeves and everything on, and he starts ramping up, does a 455. Then he goes over and he does a 475. I mean, damn. Okay. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, you know, Jason, he's got elbow sleeves and stuff on. That's not raw. You might be getting 5, 10 pounds out of those elbow sleeves. It's like, yeah, that's fair enough, but it's 475 with a pause. 475 for a pause. All right, elbow sleeves are not 475 pause bench for a guy weighing 220 who actually has a history of injuries and other issues on top of it. Um, that's freaking strong. I don't care who you are. That's strong. That's strong. Uh, I can't do that. I don't even have any friends that I can think of who can do that at that sort of body weight. Actually, I do. I have one. I have one friend. One friend who I know of who's done that at that sort of body weight. Now that I think about it, one guy, and he doesn't compete in powerlifting anymore. Um, I mean, that's strong. So what more can you say? I actually hope he gets his 500. If he gets his 500, actually, if you guys will link it to me as soon as it happens, if someone will go link it on my fan page, I'd love to see it. I hope he actually gets the 500 in the meet. I really do. After watching that, I'd like to see that happen. That would be pretty cool. But we get over to the point about injuries, though. And there are times when I don't necessarily like Mark Bell. I'm not big on the slingshot being marketed the way that he has. I think it's a bit gimmicky nonsense like that. But I mean, obviously, Mark knows how to train. He's obviously a very, very strong guy. He obviously knows what he's doing. Granted, he's admitted to using pretty copious amounts of anabolics and other stuff, but in a competitive environment against other guys using plenty of anabolics, he does pretty well. And he's a strong guy, and he does run a successful gym. So I'm listening to his talk about getting ready for when he was going to go for a 600 before. His goal was to get to a 600 bench. And he's coming up on the meet and he hits 555 for a double. And he knew at that point, he said, look, I'm the strongest I've ever been. And he said, then I started worrying about injuries. He goes, and that's where I messed up because I let it creep into my head, the idea of injuries. And that's the interesting thing about self-programming. I thought that part was interesting, that he looks back in retrospect and realizes when he let the thought creep in about injuries. And people need to understand there's a difference between self-programming with that and not saying you should be reckless, right? Our training should always be careful. Our training should always be using good technique and proper fatigue management because, quite frankly, that's how we prevent most injuries, right? What causes most injuries? Is it necessarily bad form? No. It's usually related to overuse. For most heavy lifters, people who lift really heavy weight, usually once your form is decent, I don't even mean perfect form. People actually rarely get hurt who have built a base. Once you've built a base, you rarely really get hurt even with slightly loose form. You really don't. You really don't. It's pretty rare once you have a good base and if you practice different movements. In other words, maybe lack of exercise variation can cause some slippery form to cause issues. But once you have some basic exercise variation that helps work around those things, it just comes down to fatigue management, right? It's usually overuse that causes something to get inflamed or tear or rip or we get a major problem. I mean, that's what it is most of the time. It is overuse. And it's not even always the overuse on the big exercises. It's the accessory movements that get us hurt, right? It's the accessory stuff that ends up getting us hurt if we're not careful. Improper fatigue management with a specific joint or tendon, with excessive accessory movements for it that we haven't thought through carefully. In my case, last time I pulled an erector, I had another outside issue going on, and then I pulled an erector with light pause squats. I pulled it on a pause squat, and I mean with a light weight. But I also had another factor going on. But in his case, he started thinking about things like, well, what can I do that won't get me hurt? I'll go do a bunch of press downs. So he started doing really heavy press downs with the entire stack, right? The entire stack going into it. Well, think about that for a moment. When you think about those smaller exercises, what exercises are most likely to cause you elbow problems? Skull crushers and tricep press downs, to where you keep your elbows locking at your side, right? Where you don't allow the arms to travel freely, like a strict press down. That's more likely to hurt your elbow and your tricep tendons than just about anything else you could do. There's other things that can, but I mean, things that people commonly do, that puts a lot of stress on that tendon. That can actually cause tricep inflammation and elbow inflammation and all these tendons right here by itself, right? Just that alone, done with too much workload, can absolutely cause that. And it can cause it to be there for the rest of your life. You can have it for years as a result of that. It's one reason I tell people not to do that, right? Don't do it. So what's he doing? He's at a peak of his training cycle, right? He's at the peak of his training cycle, and he wants to be able to do something without getting hurt. And so he goes and does that, and his elbow swelled way up. And he had all sorts of problems from it, had to have it looked at with doctors, and they went in and exploring it and everything, trying to find out what was wrong with his elbow. And he says his elbow swelled way up as a result of that. Well, again, it's self-programming, isn't it? He starts thinking about, oh man, I don't want to get hurt. I don't want to get hurt. What can I do? But he's now possibly let that sink in his head of hurt, injury. And then he goes and does something that, again, realistically, if you think about it logically and you're not in that mindset, if you sit back as a coach objectively and someone's going to do a bunch of really heavy press downs, he's already at a high state of fatigue, right? You're already at a high state of fatigue because he's at a peak strength. He's at the strongest bench he's ever been at, which, again, 555 for a double. Right, that's crazy. So he's already under a high level of fatigue, and his body was already fatigued, and then he goes and does something that is absolutely known with a really heavy weight, small movement with a really heavy weight, a small movement that puts stress on the elbow and these tendons. And then he develops tendonitis. Well, it was an overuse situation at that point. It's basically inflammation from chronic overuse at that point, because he came in and he did a really, really heavy small movement that stresses that area with too much workload that he wasn't able to recover from, and his body responded with a large inflammatory response. So that's something to think about, when we're looking at stuff of when you're in that state and maybe you're in a peak state, you are pushing yourself to the limits, and you start thinking in terms of what can I do to not get hurt, instead of saying, hey, maybe I need to just back down a little bit and make sure that everything is going good and just follow proper training programming and think things through. At that point, he started getting in his mindset the idea of getting hurt. And he ultimately went and did something that hurt him. And it wasn't a logical thing to do, right? It's not a logical thing to do. And that's what happens, isn't it? And I think that's something that we do need to think about. And I don't mean that we shouldn't think about injuries and we shouldn't be looking at our own form and things like that and be looking to correct stuff, that we shouldn't be looking over our training. But when you get into that mindset, when you're a serious athlete and you start thinking consciously about injuries, you start thinking about getting hurt instead of just thinking, how can I train correctly? And I know it seems like a minor thing. People say, well, but if you're thinking about training correctly and thinking about correcting technique or bringing up weak points, aren't you thinking about getting hurt? No, you're thinking about proper training. You're thinking about proper management. But when you start putting that thought process into your head of, I don't want to get injured, you are putting in your head injured. You're putting into your head hurt. And that is something to think about. I think it's something to think about because in the case of him, he programmed himself again because when you are peaking for competition, everything that you say and think programs you. Right? You are visualizing things, and that's what he visualized. He visualized getting hurt, and then in his efforts to avoid getting hurt, he went and did something that got him hurt. I think it's a profound way to look at it. I think it's a profound way to look at it. And I would say, based upon what he said, it might be wise for a lot of us to think in terms of, instead of thinking, hey, how can I avoid getting hurt? We need to be thinking in terms of how can I train correctly? How can I correct my movement patterns? How can I do these movement patterns the best way possible? How can I get my fatigue management on point to make proper gains? And always be thinking in that mentality. And that's a different way to look at things. And I think it actually works for a lot of people. Definitely something that he's learned himself, life lesson that he has as an athlete and a coach. And I think we can take something from that. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.